In 1945, thousands of Luftwaffe aircraft were left abandoned after Germany's surrender. Fighters, bombers, and experimental jet prototypes lay scattered across Europe, from major bases to improvised airfields. No other air force in the world had amassed such technical variety by the end of a conflict. When United States, British, and Soviet troops arrived at the bases of Lechfeld and Rechlin, they found an immense fleet that needed to be handled immediately. Engineers, blueprints, projects, and technologies far ahead of their time were suddenly available. What followed was not a simple distribution of enemy equipment, but a global competition to seize ideas, scientists, and industrial capabilities that could define post-war aviation. While thousands of aircraft were officially catalogued and destroyed, other operations unfolded in the shadows. German pilots negotiated their freedom by offering technical expertise. Czech factories that were supposed to be shut down continued producing components. And intelligence agents from 3 continents competed to access the same secret archives. How did the most lethal aircraft of the Third Reich end up saving the Jewish state? What secret operations were set in motion to capture the rivals' complex technology? Why did the engineers who designed the Me-262 end up working for Americans, Soviets, and Israelis? The last days of the Luftwaffe. On May 8, 1945, when Germany signed its unconditional surrender, the airfields of Central Europe still bore the visible imprint of an air force that had dominated the skies in the early years of the war. More than 5,000 aircraft remained scattered from Norway to Austria, many abandoned in the final days of the conflict. Among them were Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, Junkers Ju-88 bombers, and the advanced Me-262 jets, capable of exceeding 870 kilometers per hour. The Luftwaffe had collapsed abruptly, leaving behind a vast collection of machines, intact, damaged, or incomplete, now at the mercy of the Allies. Their discovery marked the beginning of a complex process that would reshape the victor's relationship with German technology. In the first weeks of May, the Luftwaffe existed essentially as an empty structure. Its operational capacity had been reduced to nothing by a lack of fuel, the loss of experienced pilots, and the destruction of its infrastructure. The last significant aerial activity had taken place just days before the official surrender. When units received the final order to cease all flying, the airfields fell silent. The collapse was the result of months of accelerated deterioration. Fuel production had dropped to minimal levels. In April 1945, Germany generated barely 10,000 tons of aviation fuel, compared to 180,000 tons the year before. The plants at Leuna, Pölitz, and Brooks, repeatedly hit by Allied bombing, had been unable to sustain demand. Without fuel, even the most advanced models, such as the Me-262, remained grounded. The geography of collapse revealed the disintegration of the Reich. In the north of Germany, the bases at Flensburg and Lübeck-Blankensee held massive concentrations of aircraft. Many had been moved into that region in an attempt to preserve them from the advancing Soviet forces. The airfields of Schleswig-Holstein were saturated, with aircraft parked far too close to one another, a reflection of the operational disorder of the final weeks. In Bavaria, the situation was no different. Lechfeld, one of Messerschmitt's main production centers, contained hundreds of Me-262s in every stage of manufacture. Some were fully assembled and ready to fly. Others were bare fuselages awaiting Jumo 004 engines or electrical components that would never arrive. Czech airspace also played a crucial role. Prague and its surroundings had been essential industrial hubs for the Luftwaffe. The Avia factories, for example, produced key components for models such as the Bf-109 and the Me-262. When the Allies began inspecting the area, they found warehouses filled with uninstalled engines, complete wing assemblies, and detailed technical manuals describing assembly procedures. The facilities were virtually intact. German occupation had created a well-organized network whose continuity was broken only with the end of the war. In Austria, the bases near Vienna revealed the desperate activity of Luftflotte 4, charged with protecting the oil fields in Hungary and Romania. There, Bf-109s and Fw-190s predominated, many damaged or abandoned. The runways had been bombed repeatedly, making any takeoff or landing operations extremely difficult. The lack of spare parts and the accelerated deterioration of maintenance made it clear that the Luftwaffe had lost the ability to sustain a coherent air force. Denmark displayed a different kind of accumulation. Grove had become a refuge for units retreating from the east. Among the aircraft stationed there were Ju-88G night fighters equipped with Liechtenstein radar, along with reconnaissance and transport models. For the newly liberated Danish forces, the presence of these aircraft served as a reminder of the occupation that had just ended. Rechlin, in contrast, illustrated another dimension of the collapse: the downfall of the German scientific apparatus. As the Luftwaffe's testing and development center, it housed prototypes, wind tunnel models, experimental data, and documentation on projects that had never been carried out. When Soviet troops advanced into the region, German personnel attempted to destroy critical information, but managed to eliminate only part of it. Upon arrival, the Allies found technical documents and blueprints representing years of research. The condition of the aircraft varied significantly. Some Me-262 jets, for example, had so few hours of flight that their structures appeared freshly built. Older fighters showed extreme wear. The Bf-109s and Fw-190s had engines with hundreds of accumulated hours, well beyond recommended limits. The shortage of spare parts had forced mechanics to cannibalize components, assembling aircraft from the remains of others. In many cases, the line between what was operational and what was unusable was difficult to define. The German command structure was completely fractured. After Hitler's death on April 30th, Admiral Karl Dönitz assumed leadership, but his actual ability to control the remaining Luftwaffe units was limited. Some surrendered directly to the Americans or the British, while others attempted to destroy equipment before it could be captured. At times, commanders negotiated partial agreements that included the handover of specific aircraft or the temporary preservation of certain facilities. Poor communication generated contradictory situations. Units in Norway and Denmark continued flying until May 8th itself, partly due to the lack of clear orders. The last recorded Luftwaffe air engagement of the war occurred that day near Pilsen, when an Fw-190 was shot down by American anti-aircraft fire. From that moment on, any German aircraft in the air was considered a potential threat. Allied orders were precise. All aircraft had to remain grounded, and no German crew member was allowed near them without supervision. The technical information present on the bases was scattered and disorganized. Design offices held blueprints, manuals, and test records, but lacked coherent classification after the hurried attempts to evacuate or destroy documents. The Allies found warehouses full of unidentified folders, boxes with partially labeled components, and files mixed together between different models. To understand what had been captured, it was necessary to catalogue everything piece by piece. The first Allied soldiers to enter the airfields had no specialized training. Their priorities were to secure the areas, disarm combatants, and establish control. Detailed inspection of the aircraft was left to technicians and engineers who arrived later. By then, deterioration had begun to affect the planes exposed to the elements. May brought rains that soaked fabric-covered surfaces and caused corrosion in engines and fuselages. Many airfields lacked operational hangars as they had been destroyed during the bombings. Looting became inevitable. The presence of refugees, liberated forced laborers, and displaced troops created opportunities for cockpit instruments, radios, electrical parts, or even seats to be taken. Allied guards could not always prevent such actions. Each loss complicated the future reconstruction or technical study of the captured aircraft. Despite this initial chaos, the value of the recovered material quickly became evident. German technology in jet propulsion, advanced aerodynamics, and electronic systems exceeded Allied developments in several areas. Although the United Kingdom had operated the Gloucester Meteor, the Me-262 offered features that drew attention for its speed and aerodynamic profile. The United States was still developing its first functional jets, and the Soviet Union was eager to understand the technology to accelerate its own programs. The inventory began to clarify the scope of the discovery. In Lechfeld, American teams recorded 247 Me-262s in various conditions. Of these, 93 were complete, 118 were fuselages without engines, and 36 were damaged or assigned to testing. This volume represented a considerable industrial investment, both in labor hours and in the use of strategic materials such as metal alloys and specialized electrical systems. In Flensburg, the concentration of Bf-109S reached 312 units. Many belonged to variants mass-produced in the final months, such as the G6 and G14 models. Although some were relatively new, most showed significant wear. The Daimler-Benz DB605 engines had often exceeded their operational lifespan. Allied mechanics confirmed improvised repairs that revealed the extent of operational deterioration the German Air Force had reached. The FW-190S, particularly the D9 and D11 variants, were present in notable numbers in the northern region. Their liquid-cooled Jumo engines represented a technical evolution compared to earlier radial engine models. In Husum, the British found 89 examples in acceptable condition, many with only a few accumulated flight hours. They had been produced too late to enter operational service. The Ju-80s in Grove illustrated the latest adaptation of a versatile design. The G-series variants, equipped with radar, formed neat rows on the Danish runways. Their forward-mounted antennas provided advanced night detection capabilities for their time. Although the war had ended, these systems represented a remarkable leap in the integration of aeronautical electronics. Among the most significant discoveries were prototypes and experimental models. In Rechlin, Allied technicians located a Dornier Do 335 file fitted with flight test instrumentation. This aircraft, with its push-pull configuration, reached speeds of up to 763 kilometers per hour, standing out as one of the fastest piston engine fighters ever built. Its limited production made it a rare and highly valuable technical specimen. The Heinkel He-162 was another example of accelerated development. Conceived for rapid production using non-strategic materials, it featured a structure that combined metal and wood. Its flight behavior was unstable, and several test pilots had died in accidents. The Allies recovered 47 units, many of which had never completed operational flights. The Arado R-234 offered further innovation. As the world's first operational jet bomber, it had also been used in reconnaissance missions. The capture of 18 units allowed a detailed study of its aerodynamic design and its ejection seat system, then still uncommon. The inventory also identified hundreds of Ju-52s. Their age and obsolescence made them of little technical interest, but their sheer number showed how the Luftwaffe had resorted to any available aircraft for transport and evacuation duties. Many had been converted into air ambulances in the final months, reflecting the saturation of ground hospitals. Training aircraft such as the Arado R-96 and the Booker Bu-131 appeared by the hundreds. Although they offered no advanced technology, they were essential to Germany's pilot training infrastructure. Their presence on so many airfields indicated the scale of the training effort the Luftwaffe had sustained even as the Reich was collapsing. Technical findings also included weaponry and special systems. The R-4M rockets designed for the Me-262, capable of destroying bombers with precise hits, generated immediate interest. The Mk-108 cannons, widely used in jets and fighters, demonstrated significant firepower in a compact design. The analysis of radar systems confirmed significant advances. The few G-220 Liechtenstein, capable of detecting targets several kilometers away, demonstrated the degree of technological integration Germany had achieved in night operations. Although the Allies possessed more advanced radar systems, the compact German engineering remained remarkable. Jet engines represented one of the most intensely studied fields. The Jumo 004 was an innovative axial design, though limited by the lack of heat-resistant alloys. Its service life of barely 25 hours revealed Germany's industrial difficulties in the final stage of the war. The BMW 003, smaller in size, had been planned for mass production but suffered recurring structural problems. Captured units showed fatigue damage, bearing failures, and general deterioration. Allied teams also investigated the Me-163 Comet, a rocket-powered interceptor whose performance in climb was extraordinary but hazardous in operation. Its speed and ascent capability were exceptional, yet its fuel made it a constant risk. The capture of 39 units allowed researchers to study both its strengths and its limitations. The technical documents recovered proved essential for understanding the scope of German programs. In Oberammergau, Messerschmitt's archives contained projects for aircraft that had never progressed beyond the design stage. Concepts with delta wings, supersonic configurations, and advanced propulsion systems were part of a detailed documentary collection. The wind tunnels at Göttingen and Völkenrode preserved aerodynamic data accumulated over the years. This information, which included measurements of high-speed airflow and tests of wing profiles, formed a resource of enormous value for any nation interested in developing next-generation aircraft. Its immediate availability supported comparative study among Allied engineers. The presence of forced laborers in these facilities added another dimension. Many had been compelled to assemble components or carry out precision tasks. With the end of the war, their technical testimonies helped reconstruct industrial processes and production practices. German engineers who remained in the factories collaborated with the Allies strategically, aware that their knowledge represented an opportunity to join new projects or avoid reprisals. The simultaneous presence of the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union at different airfields created complex dynamics. Each nation sought to secure access to the most important findings and keep them out of the hands of others. Although no formal structure yet existed to regulate this competition, the magnitude of the captured material foreshadowed immediate decisions about what to study, what to preserve, and what to transport to territories under secure control. As the Allies began organizing the transfer of aircraft and technical documentation to their own zones, the airfields continued to show signs of abandonment. Fuselages exposed to the weather, engines beginning to deteriorate, and incomplete equipment reflected the urgency to catalogue and preserve only what could be useful. The rest was left to an uncertain fate, as the future of the vast technological collection captured during those transitional weeks was determined. The Allied battle for German technology. The competition for German aeronautical technology did not begin with the Reich's surrender, but months before the war in Europe reached its conclusion. In early 1945, as Allied armies advanced toward the borders of Germany's industrial heartland, technical intelligence services had already defined a priority that went far beyond purely military value. It was not simply a matter of occupying territory or destroying enemy capabilities. The true ambition was to capture knowledge. Jet propulsion technology, advanced aerodynamics, and electronic systems developed by Germany represented an advantage estimated by analysts at between 5 and 10 years ahead of projects in the United States and the United Kingdom. That difference was unacceptable to the victors, both for its utility and its strategic risk. Every document, every prototype, and every German scientist became an objective. In that context, on April 22, 1945, the United States Army Air Forces formalized Operation LUSTY, administered by the Exploitation Division. Its name, an acronym for LUFTWAFFESECRETTECHNOLOGY, reflected a broad mandate that included locating, securing, evaluating, and transporting the Reich's most advanced aeronautical material to the United States. This project did not arise spontaneously. In 1944, analysts at Wright Field, Ohio, had begun preparing documents known as blacklists, exhaustive inventories of every German model, whether operational or experimental, that the Americans considered a priority for study. These lists served as a strategic guide for selecting airfields, test centers, factories, and laboratories that needed to be captured intact before other powers could reach them. Colonel Harold E. Watson assumed responsibility for directing the operation on the ground. At 39, he had accumulated experience as a test pilot and formal training in aeronautical engineering. His modest appearance concealed a remarkable ability to assess complex technologies and anticipate the practical value of each German advance. Watson personally selected his team at the beginning of 1945. He sought fighter pilots with more than 50 missions, engineers specialized in aerodynamics, mechanics capable of repairing any engine under precarious conditions, and technical intelligence experts fluent in German. From this selection emerged the group informally known as Watson's Whizzers, a cadre of specialists who accompanied combat forces in their advance, often arriving at aeronautical facilities while artillery fire could still be heard nearby. The team was divided into two sections. One was responsible for locating and securing conventional aircraft such as the Bf-109, FW-190 or Ju-88. The other, smaller and strategically more important, was dedicated exclusively to jets and advanced propulsion systems. This second section came under the direct responsibility of First Lieutenant Robert C. Strobel, a pilot from the 353rd Fighter Group with experience in escort missions and aerial combat. Strobel's combination of operational aggressiveness and technical understanding was essential for flying aircraft that until that moment had only ever been tested by German personnel. The Whizzers advanced alongside US troops, reaching newly secured airfields where columns of smoke still rose, hangars were damaged, and runways were only partially usable. At times, intelligence teams operated autonomously, disguising themselves or entering areas where regular forces had not yet fully established control. Later documents reveal that Watson even relied on German prisoners at Fort Bliss, Texas, to infiltrate zones under British, French, or Soviet authority in the days immediately following the end of the war in Europe. Their mission was to locate aircraft listed as priorities and move them into US-controlled areas before other nations could officially claim them. One of the most significant facilities discovered by the Whizzers was Lechfeld, captured in April 1945. This base near Augsburg was one of the main production and testing centers for the Me-262. When Watson's teams arrived, they found more than 200 jets scattered across hangars, runways, and maintenance areas. The initial count identified 247 Me-262s, 93 complete aircraft, 118 airframes awaiting engines, and 36 damaged or unfinished fuselages. For the Americans, the sheer number represented the possibility of assembling a full experimental fleet dedicated to studying the world's first operational jet fighter. But having the aircraft did not mean they could be flown. The Me-262 was a complex machine, equipped with sensitive engines that could suffer irreversible damage if throttled too abruptly. Its design required strict startup procedures, a multi-minute sequence managed through controls unlike anything in US standards. Additionally, some aircraft had been fitted with explosive traps, installed in the last days of the war as a measure of technological denial. Identifying and neutralizing these traps required detailed knowledge that most American personnel did not possess. The situation changed on May 8, 1945, when a German pilot, Heinz Brauer, landed at München-Riem after completing an evacuation flight. There he was approached by members of Watson's team who offered him the chance to work as a civilian contractor instead of being sent to a prisoner camp. Brauer accepted. His experience as a test pilot for the Me-262 was invaluable. In the following days, key German technicians and pilots such as Karl Bauer and Ludwig Hoffmann, directly involved in the development and testing of Messerschmitt prototypes, joined him. Their presence allowed the Whizzers to initiate an accelerated technical training process for operating captured jets. With German assistance, the best aircraft at Lechfeld were selected for transfer flights. American pilots learned detailed procedures to avoid overloading the Jumo 004 engines, techniques for handling asymmetric failures that could cause loss of control, and specific maneuvers for takeoff, a particularly vulnerable phase due to the engine's slow throttle response. Instructions were given through demonstrations, translated briefings, and supervised flights. There was no time for formal training. The priority was to move the jets to safe zones before deterioration or interference from other powers complicated the operation. The first flights from Lechfeld were directed to Saint-Dizier in France, where the aircraft would be prepared for transatlantic transfer. The journey carried risks due to the jet's unmistakable silhouette. Despite hastily painted Allied markings, several Me-262s were intercepted by Allied fighters whose crews did not recognize the origin of the aircraft. In some cases, only emergency radio communication prevented incidents. In Melun, Near Paris, demonstrations were held for senior Allied commanders. On June 27, 1945, 3 Me-262s performed high-speed passes in front of General Karl Spaatz. One had to land due to hydraulic problems, but the other two provided a clear display of the potential of German technology. During the demonstration, Strobel executed a full barrel roll, a risky maneuver for an aircraft they were only beginning to understand. The reaction of the US command confirmed the importance of thoroughly studying this aircraft. Between late June and early July, the Whizzers moved aircraft from Melun to Cherbourg, where they would be loaded onto the escort carrier HMS Reaper, part of the naval component of the operation. The transport included various fighter models, bombers, jets, and experimental prototypes, all wrapped in protective materials against maritime corrosion. The Reaper departed on July 19, 1945, carrying dozens of aircraft destined for evaluation on US soil. Once in New Jersey, the aircraft were distributed among Wright Field, Patuxent River, and other testing facilities. In this way, the United States secured a representative collection of the most advanced technologies of the defeated enemy. While the Americans completed these transfers, the United Kingdom proceeded with its own technological exploitation framework. The Royal Air Force had studied captured German aircraft throughout the war, but the end of the conflict offered the opportunity for mass access to entire facilities. The Royal Aircraft Establishment deployed technical teams in Schleswig-Holstein and other airfields in northern Germany and Denmark. Their approach differed from the American one. In addition to capturing aircraft, they sought to secure scientists, documents, and wind tunnel data that could reinforce ongoing British programs. For the British, recruiting German technical personnel became a priority under the so-called Operation Surgeon. This initiative arose from fears that the Soviet Union would incorporate these specialists into its own programs. Candidate lists included hundreds of engineers and aerodynamic experts with direct experience in advanced projects. Their transfer to the United Kingdom was intended to prevent their knowledge from being used to strengthen the capabilities of an emerging power whose relationship with the West was already showing signs of competition. At Farnborough, test pilots such as Eric Winkle Brown played a crucial role. Brown flew the Me-262, He-162, R-234 and Do-335, providing precise technical evaluations of performance, stability and flight characteristics. His comparative reports between the Me-262 and the Gloucester Meteor indicated that, in several parameters, the German jet outperformed the British aircraft. The data collected at Farnborough would influence the subsequent development of British aircraft, particularly in wing design and control systems. The public exhibition organized by the RAE at Farnborough in late 1945 brought together dozens of German aircraft. For the first time, the British public could see models that had actively participated in bombing missions or air defense operations just months earlier. While the exhibition had an educational component, it also served to consolidate internal technical evaluations. The Soviet Union developed a broader and more systematic approach based on total industrial extraction. Since 1942, the Red Army had formed trophy brigades capable of dismantling entire factories. With the final advance into Germany, these brigades expanded to include aeronautical specialists able to identify, package and transport machinery, prototypes and technical documentation. Their logic was grounded in material restitution. Germany had destroyed thousands of Soviet localities, and its infrastructure was to be compensated through direct industrial transfer. When the Soviets occupied Rechlin, they found facilities severely damaged by bombing, but still usable. Some wind tunnels and prototypes had survived in underground structures. The recovered technical documentation fed evaluation centers in Moscow and Leningrad, where teams of engineers dismantled captured models to study each component. The information obtained would contribute to Soviet jet programs that, within a few years, would reach competitive levels. The Avia facilities in Prague were of particular interest. Under German occupation, they had produced essential components for Messerschmitt fighters. After liberation, they contained engines, blueprints, and unassembled parts in nearly intact condition. In July 1945, Soviet agents requisitioned the entire factory and transported its machinery, materials, and documentation by rail to Soviet territory. The transfer of German personnel to the USSR reached its peak on October 22, 1946, with Operation LUSTY. On that day, more than 2,500 specialists and nearly 4,000 family members were forcibly moved to the Soviet Union to work on aviation, weapons, and advanced technology projects. The impact of this movement would later be reflected in Soviet developments, whose similarities to captured German aircraft were visible in aerodynamic configurations and structural parameters. The simultaneous presence of US and Soviet forces in some areas generated immediate tensions. At certain airfields near the demarcation line, both powers claimed rights over specific aircraft. Episodes were recorded in which armed units disputed possession of unique prototypes, creating situations that required rapid diplomatic intervention. Despite formal agreements, each power attempted to secure the most valuable finds without sharing critical information with their nominal allies. The order of annihilation, the industrial destruction of an air force. The directive that would determine the final fate of thousands of German aircraft was issued in mid-1945 and reached Allied commands with an unequivocal instruction. Following the fall of the Nazi regime, the immediate priority had been to secure the most advanced material and understand the industrial and technical capabilities that had sustained the German war effort. Once that initial phase was completed, the question remained of what to do with the immense volume of aircraft, components, engines and structures that had no direct use and represented a material surplus incompatible with the demilitarization process imposed on Germany. The mandate was clear. Every remaining aircraft had to be eliminated irreversibly. In the months following the surrender, the airfields of Central Europe became transitional spaces where the immediate past coexisted with an uncertain present. On makeshift runways and at bases severely damaged during the fighting, complete fuselages, incomplete aircraft, and structures that had been moved or abandoned during the final weeks of the conflict accumulated. These remnants were not only a testament to wartime production, but also an operational problem requiring a rapid solution. Allied commanders understood that leaving this material on German soil could fuel illicit markets for components, supply clandestine projects, or simply deteriorate to the point of becoming a danger to local communities. The decision to destroy thousands of aircraft was not taken solely for security reasons. For post-war administrators, physically eliminating the remnants of the Luftwaffe was part of a symbolic process accompanying the military defeat of the Third Reich. In the view of Allied leadership, Europe's reconstruction required dismantling the offensive military infrastructure that had enabled the regime to sustain a large-scale war. The removal of aircraft, hangars, maintenance facilities, and spare parts depots was intended to ensure that Germany could not rebuild an autonomous air force in the years immediately ahead. The scale of the task became evident as dismantling teams began their work. Airfields in northern Germany, Austria and Denmark displayed vast stretches of land where hundreds of aircraft were lined up in the open. Some had been damaged by air raids, others by prolonged abandonment, and many were in relatively good condition. However, physical condition had no bearing on the criteria for elimination. Allied leadership had determined that German origin and potential military use were sufficient grounds to justify complete destruction, regardless of an aircraft's technical value. Dismantling procedures varied depending on each region's industrial capacity. In areas with intact or recoverable infrastructure, the process resembled an inverted manufacturing operation. Teams of engineers and technicians classified the aircraft by size, predominant materials and accessibility. Electrical, hydraulic and mechanical components that could be reused or melted down separately were then removed. Each fuselage was transformed into a sequence of parts: wing sections, metal skin panels, spars, internal structures and control surfaces. These were sent to foundry yards, where they were converted into recycled alloys, destined for civilian and industrial use. In other areas, where fighting and bombing had destroyed the necessary infrastructure, more rudimentary but equally effective methods were applied. Some teams used tracked tractors to topple and fragment entire fuselages. Steel cables were wrapped around main structures, and the mechanical force of the vehicles tore off complete sections of the aircraft. This method, while less precise, was fast and allowed the planes to be reduced to fragments transportable to recycling or disposal centers. The labor supporting these processes came from various sources. In the months immediately following the surrender, German prisoners of war played a central role in dismantling operations. Under Allied supervision, they performed tasks ranging from engine removal to metal sorting. In many cases, they were specialists familiar with the technology they were dismantling, which accelerated the technical process. For them, the work represented both an imposed obligation and a way to access food, shelter, and some stability in a devastated country. In civilian areas, the local population also participated in the final phase of destruction. The shortage of construction materials in 1945 led to the reuse of aluminum sheets, metal panels, and structural parts for repairing damaged homes. Although this reuse was not part of an official plan, Allied authorities tolerated, and in some cases discreetly encouraged, the exploitation of resources that would otherwise have been left exposed with no clear purpose. European reconstruction came to depend in part on materials salvaged from aircraft whose operational life had ended. Metal recycling represented one of the most significant economic dimensions of the process. Allied forces estimated that an average aircraft could yield large quantities of aluminum, steel, and other valuable metals. However, the combination of alloys used in aeronautical manufacturing posed technical challenges during subsequent smelting. The structures combined aluminum with specific chemical treatments, magnesium components in critical areas, steel in fasteners, and copper in electrical systems. Segregating these materials required time and specialized attention. Even so, the overall value of the recovered metal motivated the Allies to maintain the dismantling program, even when international scrap prices fell due to oversupply. At port facilities and industrial centers in countries such as the United Kingdom, material from German aircraft was incorporated into naval reconstruction, machinery manufacturing, and consumer goods production on a continent that needed to replace destroyed civil infrastructure. Obtaining strategic metals through dismantling proved faster than mining or importing and complemented economic recovery programs during a period of extreme scarcity. Not all aircraft followed formal recycling routes. In rural areas or locations far from industrial centers, converting planes into scrap was not logistically profitable. In such cases, the aircraft were simply buried or deposited in pits designated for military waste. While these practices were not ideal for future documentation, they offered a quick and economical solution. Over time, some of these sites became covered by vegetation, civil infrastructure, or later industrial facilities, permanently obscuring the physical trace of what had once been part of the German air fleet. Allied commanders were aware that aircraft destruction also carried a diplomatic dimension. The Potsdam Agreement required the elimination of Germany's offensive military capability, and verifying compliance was an essential part of occupation policy. Yards filled with destroyed structures served as visible evidence of demilitarization. Photographs of aircraft reduced to fragments circulated among international delegations and were used to confirm adherence to the agreed measures. In this context, destroying aircraft was not only a technical act, but also a political one. Some countries temporarily used German aircraft before their destruction, especially in regions where air infrastructure had been devastated. In France, repaired German planes briefly served to cover military transport routes and reconnaissance missions before being replaced by domestic models or aircraft supplied by Allies. This temporary use was primarily a practical response to immediate post-war needs when the availability of airworthy planes was extremely limited and any aerial capability was valuable. Even so, these exceptions did not alter the overall trend. The ultimate objective remained the complete elimination of remaining material. As months passed, airfields that had housed entire fleets began to empty. Dismantling yards became spaces where piles of metal awaited transport to foundries. Runways that had seen thousands of takeoffs and landings were transformed into open land designated for civilian or agricultural use. The gradual disappearance of these aeronautical remnants coincided with urban transformations across Europe. On former military bases, infrastructure was adapted to civilian needs. Some runways were converted into commercial airports, while other sites were dedicated to agricultural, industrial, or residential purposes. The physical presence of the former fleet vanished as regional governments and occupation authorities defined new uses for these areas. Elimination operations continued until the late 1940s. By then, most aircraft had been destroyed, converted into ingots, or buried. Of the thousands of planes remaining in Europe in May 1945, only a minimal fraction survived in private collections, emerging museums, or specific testing facilities. The vast majority disappeared without leaving a tangible trace beyond photographs and technical documents preserved in military archives. The Nazi fighters that saved the Jewish state. While the majority of German aircraft disappeared into scrapyards and smelting furnaces across occupied Europe, a much smaller portion followed an unexpected path. Instead of being reduced to metal fragments, some airframes survived thanks to particular industrial circumstances in Central Europe. In Czechoslovakia, the aeronautical infrastructure inherited from the occupation remained surprisingly intact. After years of forced production for the Luftwaffe, factories such as Avia in Čakovice and Letecké závody in Vysočany retained tools, incomplete assembly lines, technical blueprints, and skilled personnel familiar with German manufacturing processes. When the war ended, this collection of facilities became one of the few spaces in Europe where military aircraft could be produced immediately without starting from scratch. In the Czech hangars, there were partially assembled fuselages of the Messerschmitt F109G, the most widely produced variant in the final months of the conflict. Although the basic structure remained, stocks of Daimler-Benz DB605 engines had vanished. A warehouse fire in the last days of the war had destroyed nearly all stored units. For the Czechoslovak government, the solution came from an available resource: Juncker's Jumo 211F engines used in twin-engine He-111 bombers that had also been assembled there. These were inverted V-12 liquid-cooled engines, but their weight, dimensions, and performance characteristics were sufficiently different to require a substantial redesign of the forward fuselage. The adaptation resulted in a hybrid aircraft whose appearance recalled the Bf-109, but whose performance differed significantly. The new plane was designated the Avia S-199. It combined the original German fuselage with a heavier, less powerful power plant. The redesign required the removal of the front-mounted cannon aligned with the propeller shaft, a hallmark of the original design. The forward-shifted center of gravity and increased torque of the Jumo engine made control during takeoff and landing challenging. Even so, the project moved forward because Czechoslovakia needed to quickly rebuild its air force and lacked immediate alternatives. In March 1947, the S-199 made its first flight, and over the following 2 years, hundreds of units were built for both training and operational service. Although the aircraft had obvious limitations, it fulfilled a crucial transitional role for post-war Czechoslovakia, whose pilots required a fighter capable of flying until new models imported or supplied by Allied powers became available. Gradually, Soviet models such as the Yak-23 and MiG-15 replaced the S-199 in the early 1950s, marking the end of its local service. However, the aircraft would not gain notoriety in Central Europe, but rather in a territory newly integrated into the global political map. In May 1948, when Israel declared its independence, the region was already engulfed in open war. Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq mobilized forces in a coordinated attack. The new nation lacked any effective air capability, possessing only light aircraft and improvised units unable to confront the fighters and bombers of the Arab armies. In addition, an international arms embargo prohibited the transfer of military equipment to any party involved. This situation forced Israeli leaders to seek alternative sources. Agents deployed in Europe identified Czechoslovakia, still outside the rigid alignments of the emerging Cold War, as having newly produced S-199s available for sale. Negotiations were conducted discreetly. Czechoslovakia agreed to sell a batch of fighters, aware of the economic importance of such transactions in foreign currency. For Israel, the price was high, especially considering the technical limitations of the aircraft, but operational necessity outweighed any reservations. Only pilots with prior combat experience during World War II could transition quickly to the new type, as its handling demanded advanced skills. Israeli and foreign volunteers with aeronautical experience traveled to Czech bases for accelerated training. There, they completed initial flights in locally produced Arado trainers and then conducted limited practice in the two-seat version of the S-199. Time was critical. The situation in the Middle East was deteriorating daily, and combat operations required pilots ready for immediate deployment. The delivery of the fighters to Israel was carried out through clandestine flights and transport by cargo aircraft. Upon arrival at local facilities, ground crews assembled the S-199s with available resources. Some aircraft lacked reliable radios, and weapons testing was minimal due to the urgency of the situation. Despite these limitations, the first operational deployment occurred on May 29, 1948, when an Israeli force flew toward Egyptian positions to halt a ground advance threatening Tel Aviv. The S-199s took off without having completed adequate test flights and without pilots being able to verify weapon behavior under combat conditions. The immediate objective was to intervene with sufficient force to disrupt the Egyptian advance. The tactical impact of the attack was limited in material terms, but it proved decisive strategically. The surprise created by the sudden appearance of Israeli fighters caused the Egyptian units to halt their advance while reorganizing their defenses. This pause allowed Israeli ground forces to consolidate positions and prepare counterattacks, altering the course of operations along the coastal sector. In the following days, the S-199s participated in additional missions, including intercepting Egyptian transport aircraft that had bombed civilian targets in Israeli territory. These actions, though carried out by a small number of planes, marked the first occasion on which the Israeli Air Force was able to challenge the air superiority previously held by the Arab armies. The limitations of the S-199 became evident from its very first missions. Its power plant generated vibrations and unexpected reactions, and transitions between low and high power during critical maneuvers could result in loss of control. The synchronization system between the machine guns and the propeller proved particularly problematic. Misaligned firing could strike the blades, causing damage that was sometimes irreparable in flight. The accident rate rose quickly, not only due to combat but also mechanical failures. Even so, pilots continued to operate the aircraft as the war progressed, often with only 3 or 4 airworthy planes available. The S-199's contribution to Israel's immediate survival was not based on its technical performance, but on its availability at a moment when no other option existed. The model recorded modest victories, including the downing of transport aircraft and enemy fighters, and provided the nascent Air Force with an initial capability that would later be replaced by superior models such as the Spitfire, and subsequently by domestically produced or regularly acquired aircraft. By the end of 1948, most S-199s had been lost in combat or accidents, and the remaining operational aircraft were relegated to secondary or training roles before being retired completely. The Israeli experience was not the only case in which German aircraft found post-war operational continuity. Some European countries temporarily used models inherited from the occupation or acquired through indirect transfers. France briefly incorporated several German planes to cover transport and reconnaissance needs before fully restoring its own industrial capacity. Spain, whose aeronautical industry had produced modified versions of the Bf-109 and HE-111 during the war, continued manufacturing variants adapted to foreign engines until the late 1950s. In Switzerland, aircraft acquired before and during the conflict remained in service for border air defense while the country updated its fleets. The reuse of German aircraft in these contexts reflected both operational necessity and post-war industrial limitations. Beyond the temporary use of certain models, the technical legacy of German aviation influenced developments in multiple powers. Studies of aerodynamic profiles, lightweight metal structures, and wing configurations informed jet aviation programs that emerged in the following years. In countries undertaking advanced aeronautical engineering projects, analysis of German components, wind tunnels and construction methods provided significant reference material for the transition to higher speeds and new propulsion types. This process was not limited to jets. It encompassed engines, control systems and manufacturing techniques that were progressively integrated into the international aerospace industry. Few S-199s survived the passage of time. Today, aviation museums in Prague and Hatzarim preserve some of these aircraft as a testament to a brief but decisive chapter in post-war aviation history. Although their performance cannot compare with other fighters of the era, their historical significance lies in the context in which they operated. These were aircraft built with limited resources, serving an emerging nation under exceptional circumstances, representing a unique intersection between inherited industrial infrastructure and immediate strategic needs. Their story illustrates how technology, once separated from its original purpose, can be transformed and adapted to entirely different contexts. The transition of the S-199 from Czech assembly lines to Israeli airfields encapsulates the shifting nature of post-war aviation, where machines were no longer tied solely to the conflict that produced them and acquired new roles. By the time the last examples completed their operational life in the late 1940s, their story had already transcended technical boundaries, becoming part of a broader process of military and political redefinition in a world striving to reorganize after the effects of global conflict.